Joining us now for further analysis on this debate is Kristen Ruby. She's the president of the Ruby Media Group and a social media analyst that focuses on this very issue. So, Kristen, censorship. Right now, it's in the headlines, but this isn't necessarily a new concept, is it?
Exactly, Alex. It's not new at all. I mean, for those of us who have been covering this and tracking tech tyranny, this has been going on for years. So this sort of left-wing assertion here that all of this just came up last week is completely false. This has been happening for years, and we are slowly chipping away at losing our right to free speech and at being censored online, which is why this whole notion of social media regulation and big tech and antitrust is so important right now.
And of course, many Republicans have used the threat of repealing Section 230. For those who don't know, it's a liability shield for these companies, meaning you can't sue Twitter, for example, for anything that is violence that's posted on the platform or anything defamatory. You can go after the individual user, but these companies are protected. Do you think that's a viable way to go at these companies, or do you think maybe there's a different strategy?
Section 230 needs to be amended. It has not been changed in many years. And Section 230 was written in a pre-social media era when now Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Clubhouse, this is the new public square. So we, just like with a contract, you update your contracts every year. If I'm a business owner, I wouldn't be using the same contract today that I wrote with clients 14 years ago. And that is essentially the same thing that's going on with Section 230.
And it's a great point because, I mean, the internet is still the wild, wild west in a way. I mean, even what you're talking about right now, Section 230, that was originally for phone lines, things of that nature, internet service providers to make sure that they carried everything. But here we are, I think it was passed in 1994, something like that. I might be a couple of years off, but here we are at least 20 years later, and we're looking at the same law being applied to something that people back then couldn't really fathom. They couldn't understand what Facebook was going to be or Twitter, anything like that. So when we talk about an alternative to repealing 230 or tweaking it in any way, what's that mean? Does it bring with it an enforcement mechanism, an arbitration type of thing to kind of litigate these cases? What else is there?
Absolutely. So it does bring with it litigation and arbitration, as you mentioned, but the challenge, there's a few different challenges here. Yeah. So one is that no one is necessarily saying, no one is debating the free speech component of this in terms of what Twitter did. The challenge is that if you are going to have regulations and laws like this, they have to be enforced equally across the board for any politician, regardless of what party they are from. And as we have seen from Twitter, they have not done that. And that is really the challenge that we're faced with here.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think that too often this is made a partisan issue when it's not necessarily the case. I mean, I think that people on both sides can get on board with making sure that free speech maybe comes before a company's rights to silence people, things of that nature. And it is a little bit of a strange time because I think that so many people want to make it pro or anti-Trump that they're put in a situation where they're defending Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey over the rights of individuals to speak. Do you think that's right?
Yes. Yeah, I think the challenge that we have is that people are declaring this a victory when this is not a victory. This is a scary time, and they cannot look far ahead to see what actually they're losing by this one precedent that will be set here. You know, I was on Clubhouse last night, this new social media audio-only platform. And another challenge that we have is there was a room, and it was all about Trump being banned from Twitter. It was not a debate. It was called a debate. Except they have 10 people on the virtual stage who are not debating at all. They're all saying the same exact thing. Yeah. And that is the problem we have with social media. If you want to have a debate, show both sides. We don't have that. We have one side on social media right now, and that side is the left.
And of course, that plays into the very problems that we see in the real world. I mean, we're talking about polarization taking place in this country, divisions in this country, and that comes back to the echo chambers that we really experience online. And in fact, I think that we could look at, for example, the summer's riots as well as the siege on January 6th and kind of acknowledge the fact that online information does fuel real life things. I mean, that's a perfect example of it. Are Americans just becoming less willing to hear alternative arguments?
Yes. They absolutely are. And from my experience, I would say that we're on the brink of a digital civil war. I know there's been a lot of talk about, being on the brink of a regular civil war here, but I don't think people realize what's going on online. And what happened with Parler is a perfect example of that. And Republicans, if they really want to compete, when we talk about an era of cancel culture, perhaps Republicans need to sort of take the reins back and do some canceling of their own. The problem is that they are never going to be able to do that if they are relying on people to host their platforms that fundamentally disagree with their ideology to begin with. So if you want to compete in this marketplace as a conservative business, you need to create your own foundation and ecosystem from the ground up.
And we've seen how hard that could be because you essentially have to make your own Google, your own Apple, and then your own Amazon in order to just make an app that other people can download. But I think that when we're looking at the most recent events too, I kind of got the message that perhaps Silicon Valley tech giants weren't taking Republicans' threats about Section 230 seriously, acknowledging the fact that here we are and now the sitting president of the United States has been purged from all the platforms for that matter. Does that suggest then that perhaps they are taking Democratic threats of regulation more seriously? We've heard people like Elizabeth Warren say that they could be breaking up tech companies. Do you think that's what's happening, or do you think it was just an arbitrary decision?
It's unclear if that is what is happening. However, I believe that we are at the point where it does need to happen. Regulation needs to be put on the table. These are now utilities, and we saw what happened with AT&T. And if we look at the history of this, these are portals and mechanisms that Americans need to communicate. When you cut people off from that portal of communication because you choose to say that they violated your terms of service or that you engaged in hate speech, and perhaps that could be correct. But then if you're going to enforce that, enforce it for anyone that engages in hate speech, and don't change it depending on what your personal bias is. What I always say as we enter into this new era of machine learning and AI is that those who control the algorithms really control the platform. And we have to look at what sort of training mechanisms are going on behind the scenes for the people that are writing Google, for example, their handbook, their quality rater guidelines. Who are these people? What do we even know about them? Not much.
It's such a good point because I think it's important to remember, too, that human beings have to make the algorithm. Sometimes that is used as a scapegoat a little bit to say, well, it's a mathematical equation, a formula that really doesn't have anything to do with it. But that's not necessarily the case. In fact, I think that we can acknowledge the fact that a lot of these tech companies are a lot of people who are living in the San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley. They may be a little bit detached from the average American. And I'm not saying that necessarily all of the things that they do are inherently biased, but I think it comes into play even if it's a subliminal thing on their parts. Do you think that's the case as well, even when it comes to the rules and the equations, things of that nature?
Yes, they are absolutely detached from everyday Americans. Just spend a few hours on Clubhouse and look at what they're talking about. They're talking about who wants to be a millionaire or a billionaire when Americans are waiting on stimulus checks. Okay, so there is a digital divide and sort of an echo chamber that we create that is really far from the reality that most everyday Americans are faced with, especially in the middle of a pandemic.
And it seems like an issue, too, that more people are starting to care about. In fact, I remember a couple of years ago, even talking about censorship, things of that nature, a lot of people said, it'll never get to that point. Don't worry. Alex Jones, I think, was the first example that really came to light for a lot of people. And I think that because of perhaps his controversial past, some people were willing to give that a pass altogether. But I think there were some people that really thought that this is the beginning of a slippery slope. And it appears that we have hit that point where, once again, we're seeing the sitting president of the United States getting purged from these platforms. Does this escalate even more so from this point forward?
Oh, absolutely. With a Democrat-led House, this will escalate. We are in it for a tough 4 years. I believe that the Democrats really want to make us suffer and pay for the Trump administration and what has gone on. And one of the areas we are really going to see that is with big tech and social media platforms, and what sort of happens with that narrative and the conversation around regulation over the next few years.
And you bring up a really good point, too. I mean, at least over the next 2 years now, Democrats will have the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. So it appears that if Republicans want to do anything about this issue, and many of them think that it's an existential issue, saying if we can't have our debates online, we're not going to get our ideas out there, and we're not going to win elections. So are Republicans really stuck in this position, at least for the next 2 years, and they are resting on the hopefulness that they take back the House or the Senate in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, so going back to what I said earlier, Republicans are only stuck if they see themselves as stuck. If they come together and create this new ecosystem as a way to do business, that could be very powerful, right? Because that is saying we're taking the power back and we're not relying on you for goods, products, services, and vendors to do business. The problem is, if that doesn't happen, you are relying on people that can cut you off at any given time in the cancel culture era that now reigns supreme.
And we've seen how effective that could be. I mean, just yesterday, Ben Shapiro, for example, edited the Politico playbook about how those on the left want to ostracize those on the right, and kind of proving his point. There was a huge backlash to that, saying Ben Shapiro should not have this platform. He should not have this right. I think that it speaks into all the things that you're putting together right now. Cancel culture, censorship, polarization. It all comes back to the same issue. And I think that's why it's important to acknowledge, because once again, online conversations have real life effects, as we've seen over the past couple of years. But Kris and Ruby, I really appreciate you coming on the show tonight and breaking down this debate, because it's going to be an important one. Thank you.